Hello everybody, welcome to Facebook Friday. My name is Kate Wakelin and I am the NET Patient Support Nurse from Neuroendocrine Cancer Australia. Each week hop into our private Facebook private discussion group and address a topic of the week. Sometimes I have a guest, sometimes it's just me, and this week it's just me. So lovely for those who, to see those who are joining already. Yeah, look, let's get started. So this week we're going to go back to basics. We've been doing a few of these this year, just knowing that nets are so very complicated and it's a lot to get your head around. And so we're trying to do a few, I guess, concise videos that just help address some of that basic information that really you want to get your head around before you've sort of gone down the path too far. So here we go. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I am broadcasting to you from, which is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So I would just like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I say this every week because it's something I very much appreciate, which is that I love to go running along the Yarra River in my area, which in the Woiwurrung language is called the Birrung. So I know that you're all joining me from all of the various corners of the country and maybe even further abroad. So just, I guess, extending that acknowledgement to where you are joining me from. So today we're going to get back to basics. I'm not going to, often I do talk about COVID. I'm not going to talk about COVID very much today because I feel like we've talked about it a lot in our private discussion group and when we've addressed it quite comprehensively in our Facebook Friday. One thing I do need to say though is that I do know lots about nets and I do know lots about, I've done a lot of reading about the COVID vaccines, but I cannot give you advice about whether or not this vaccine is good for you. I cannot tell you whether, you know, I can't advise you about dosage. I can't advise you about brand. I've had lots of inquiries this week. And I love it that people feel free to email me and call me and send me messages on Facebook, but please don't ask me any questions on Facebook Messenger because you'll just get a really short kind of, you know, I can't answer questions on Facebook Messenger, sorry, kind of reply. But, you know, I love it that people send me emails and ask me the questions that they want to know the answers to. I can't answer them about COVID. I will be referring you to your doctor. The broad advice for people with nets is that the vaccines are just as safe as for anyone else. There are no reported cases in the, I think, 1.34 billion people who've had vaccines in the world so far. I have not heard of any reports of anyone having a carcinoid crisis or any particular reaction related to having a neuroendocrine cancer. So we know that these are broadly very well tolerated for people with nets. And we also know that people with cancer, if they get COVID-19, they do very badly. So the advice broadly is please go and have your vaccine, have the vaccine that's available to you, have it soon. We know that, you know, it's very contagious and it's breaking out of quarantine pretty much most weeks. We're seeing some people who have come out of quarantine but have managed to still catch it, or someone from the quarantine facility has managed to catch it. So the broad advice is get your vaccine, talk to your doctor about your own situation, and I can't answer the questions. So sorry for going on about that. I might be a little bit more strident than usual, but I have had a lot of inquiries about it. And I guess the other thing for me as the net nurse is that my time's actually fairly full. There's about 20,000 people or more than 20,000 people in Australia living with nets. So I'm actually fairly busy answering inquiries from people who are newly diagnosed. And every time someone sends me a little question of, oh, is this drug okay for my doctor to prescribe to me, or is it all right for me to have the vaccine? It does just mean that it makes the delays a little bit longer for those who are inquiring about net related stuff. So I'm really keen to try and narrow my focus back in to neuroendocrine tumor type inquiries if I can. That's enough of me being stern and cross and setting the ground rules. I'm going to talk a bit more about, I'm going to talk about back to basics. And today we're going to talk about stage, and we're going to talk about grade. And look, I call these things back to basics, and then I think, oh my goodness, what did I call it back to basics? Like, it's really complicated, this stuff. Anyway, we'll give it a go. But before I launch in, of course, anything that I say, please do check it with your own doctor before you take anything on board. This is general advice and information only. And, you know, you want to learn one thing about NETs really quickly is that every single person is different. So I can see someone from Perth has just said, morning. I think, yeah, it is morning still over in Perth. Good afternoon to everybody else. So I'm going to start with hopefully the easier end of stage and grade. And that is to talk about stage, because that's a little bit more simple. Once you start delving into the whole grade equation, it gets complicated quite quickly. So let's talk about stage. And look, they're really similar words. It's actually very easy to sort of get them mixed up with each other. And a lot of people say to me, oh, I've got grade 4, for example, and there isn't a grade 4, if you're wondering, spoiler alert. So yeah, it's important that we know the difference. So stage refers to one really simple thing, and that is, where is the cancer in your body? Okay, so stage is where it is, and it goes from stage 1 through to stage 4. So stage 1 is where we find a single tumour, and we think that is the only tumour you have. There's no lymph nodes positive, there's no metastatic spread, there's nothing else on any of the scans. A lot of our stage 1 tumours that we find in neuroendocrine tumours are actually in the appendix. So it's not that uncommon actually to get people diagnosed with they might go to hospital for an appendicitis, they take the appendix out, they put that under the microscope, and if it, 40 years ago, we always used to take our appendixes to school and for show and tell in a little jar, just ready for your lunch to whet your appetite. These days we put appendixes under the microscope, and sometimes we find there's a small neuroendocrine tumour in the appendix, and often we find there's no tumour anywhere else. So that's a really, it's an interesting phenomenon. Time will tell whether there's actually a huge increase in the number of appendiceal tumours out there, or whether it's just that we're putting them under the microscope these days and we're seeing more of them. So that's a common place to find a stage 1 neuroendocrine tumour. And usually the appendix ones are actually quite low grade. I'll talk about grade a bit more in a minute. Stage 2 and stage 3 are a little bit murky. So I'm going to talk about them in one bucket. They depend, so stage 2 and stage 3 mean they're talking about two things. They're talking about the size of the tumour, and they're talking about whether there are any lymph nodes around the tumour area. And what we know is that, look, our whole body is bathed in this lymphatic fluid, and the lymphatic fluid has all of our, really excellent immune cells floating around in it, so we can fight infection and fight foreign weirdnesses going on in our body, foreign bodies. So fluid is constantly moving around our body, lymph fluid, and it's draining to the lymph nodes. And they're like a little central processing unit or a sub-processor for your body's immune system. So what we find often is that if there's a tumour, the first place it will go is it'll drain. There might be a piece of tumour that breaks off and drains and goes into the surrounding lymph nodes. So if you have a small tumour, it might have only gone into 1 or 2 nodes. That might be a stage 2. But if you've got a larger tumour and it's gone into lots more of those lymph nodes, it'll be a stage 3. So stage 4 means that you've got tumour somewhere else from where that cancer started. So you might have had an appendix tumour that might have spread into lymph nodes, and when they do a Gallium-68 PET scan, they might find that actually you've got some tumour cells, some tumours or a tumour in your liver. Might only be a very small tumour, might be a very slow growing tumour, but if you've got any tumours anywhere else really, it's stage 4. Now stage 4 sounds really dramatically scary. But the thing, you know, you'll learn about NETs is that they are really, really individual. There are no rules. So what might be a really scary prospect in another cancer may not actually be quite as bad as you're dreading in NETs. So I've got, for example, a person who's had stage 4 neuroendocrine cancer since 1984. So it's possible to have stable disease at stage 4. Certainly it's, you know, it's not great news. I'd much prefer to have an ingrown toenail, but I guess the thing is that it's not completely dire if it is stage 4. And actually over 50% of patients with neuroendocrine cancers, we don't find them till they're stage 4 because they don't give us very many symptoms when they're small, and then the symptoms they tend to give us are really vague. They mimic other conditions, so it's not uncommon for people to have a delay in the diagnosis. We're working really hard to educate doctors so that they know what to look out for and what tests to do, but we've got a long way to go with that, and actually they're just really hard to find. So a lot of people, they have metastatic disease or stage 4 at the time they're diagnosed. So I hope that clarifies stage, and that was the easy one. So now I'm going to talk about grade, and I'm going to do something I haven't tried before just on my own. I know that I've had guests on where they've shared their screen, and I'm going to try and share my screen, which I think will mean that I can't see people's comments. So I can see, oh, what comes first on your histology report, stage or grade? Well, often that's a good question. I'm going to address that now before I hang into grade. Stage may not be, you might not know what stage you are on a histology report, because that will report on the tumour. It will report on if there were any lymph nodes taken out and what's in the lymph nodes. But a histology report won't tell you what's in your liver, won't tell you what's in your bones, what's in your lungs, what's in your brain, what's elsewhere in your body. So it's a really good question. You don't actually find stage, all of the information about stage on a histology report. Although if you've got lymph nodes positive, you know, you're either a stage 2 or a stage 3. And maybe a stage 4 depending on your other tests. Good question. So I'm going to talk about grade. See, even I'm confused, and I'm going to try and share a screen. So let's bear with me. I won't be able to see your comments for a minute, and while I'm just looking at these pictures. And the reason I wanted to share a screen and show you some pictures is that there's a very excellent nuclear medicine physician down at Peter Mac in Melbourne called Professor Michael Hoffman. He's most of our doctors are brains on legs, and he is no different. He's a person who works very well visually, and he created this amazing diagram or an amazing chart of neuroendocrine tumours and their grades. And so I'm going to share, what I've done is I've actually broken it into pieces. I'm going to share it with you in stages. We'll see if this works. It's an experiment. If it doesn't work, then it's me, not you. So bear with me for a second while I just, here we go. Okay, you will hopefully be able to see what I'm looking at. And as I said, I can't see the comments, so, you know, we'll just, hopefully it's working. So firstly, grade refers to how similar your tumour cells look to normal neuroendocrine cells. So you might remember from a Back to Basics video a couple of episodes ago, neuroendocrine tumours grow from neuroendocrine cells, and we've all got neuroendocrine cells in our body. What happens with a tumour is you get a mutation in the genetic material of some of those cells, and they forget that they're only supposed to be, you know, making new cells only every now and again when they need to. They make lots of new cells all the time, and that's what makes a lump, or called a tumour. You can have a very small mutation, so the cell actually looks really similar to a normal neuroendocrine cell, and that is down this end. So that you can imagine, I don't know, you can't see a normal neuroendocrine cell to compare it to, but they're pretty similar. But you can see here that as the grade increases, the tumour cells look really quite varied. So you can see here, there's some that have turned red, there's more yellow in here. And obviously they don't look exactly like this under the microscope, but you can see here in the grade, the very high grade tumours, these are really wonky. You can see here that actually there's 2 central bits, which is called the nucleus. That's common in high-grade tumours. And there's 2 ways of describing them. So the lower grade tumours are called well differentiated, and that means that you can see the individual cells. Poorly differentiated is also known as NEC, and you might have heard some people in our private discussion group and around talking about NETs that are actually called NEC. NEC stands for neuroendocrine carcinoma, and that's a different category, so it's over here on a ledge on its own, and that is the really big mutation. What we find is that you might be able to tell from the colouring down this end, the very low grade tumours, they tend to grow more slowly. They tend to behave a bit more like neuroendocrine tissue, whereas the further along we go, the more quickly they grow, the more aggressively they grow. And so, I think, Michael's looked at that and gone, well, let's make them a red colour. So that's how that comes along. So grade 1, 2, and 3 neuroendocrine tumours are called well differentiated. Poorly differentiated tumours are called neuroendocrine carcinomas, and I'm going to talk a bit more about what grade that is, because that's a newer definition, and it's from so there's an organisation called ENETS, which is the European Neuroendocrine Tumour Society, and there's another big organisation called the World Health Organization, and they together sort out these grading systems. So moving right along. So you can see here, all I've done is we've got grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and then the third grade 3, or this is the other grade 3, which is NEC. Sometimes people call that grade 3B, is the other word used. So if you've been told you've got poorly differentiated grade 3 neuroendocrine carcinoma, that's what that means. If you've got a grade 1 tumour, that means your tumour cells are much more like normal neuroendocrine tissue. So we've got an ENETS grade, which is the grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and then poorly differentiated grade 3. And we've got down here a new arrow, which just says slowly growing to rapidly growing. And the thing I wanted to talk about now is this Ki-67. There was a conversation on our Facebook private discussion group last week where someone was talking about Ki-67 and wondering what's that when it's at home, and it's related directly to, it's a way of measuring the grade of your tumour. So Ki-67 refers to a protein that cells make when they're about to make a new cell. So normal tissue has, some of those normal cells, if I took a scrape of the skin off my nose and looked at it under the microscope, did the Ki-67 stain, some of those cells would be making new cells because my skin is replacing itself all of the time. But obviously we know that tumours, when they've had a mutation, they are making way more cells than they should be, which is why we've got tumours that are growing. So, but the very slow growing, we find that the Ki-67, so that the percentage of tumours that are expressing that protein, and it's done with a stain under the microscope. So less than 2% of those tumour cells are actively reproducing. So that's quite a low number. That means that tumour is only growing very slowly, only making new cells very slowly. So you can see here grade 2 is where the Ki-67% is between 3 and 20%. And I think the thing to note about grade 2 is that's actually a really big range. That's a long way from 3 to 19. So that's why people might say, I've got a low grade 2, or I've got a more slow growing grade 2. They might be like, 4 or 5 or 6. Whereas someone who's got a Ki-67 of say 17, 18, 19, 20, that is going to be considered a more fast growing or a more aggressive type of neuroendocrine tumour. And then we've got the grade 3 that is still in the well differentiated category, and that is where the Ki-67 is over 20%. So I hope that's clear. That actually, you know, you can see a little cartoony depiction of what those tumour cells are doing. They are seriously weird compared to those ones. You know, they're all saying, I'm an individual, you know, yeah, so the Ki67 is higher because more of them are actively dividing at the time. And then the poorly differentiated neuroendocrine carcinoma is also where the Ki67 is over 20. So the Ki67, once you get to over 20, it really, the question is it well differentiated or is it poorly differentiated? Now, the other thing that you will see on this chart, which is important, is this thing that says GAT8 and this thing that says FDG. And if you've been around the block a few times, you'll know that these are the names of two scans. So the GAT8 is the Gallium-68 PET scan. And a Gallium-68 PET scan is measuring this thing called oops, I've gone too far up. So back where we were, the somatostatin receptors. So normal neuroendocrine cells have somatostatin receptors. It's like an information kind of USB port. You get information into the cell, so it tells the cell when to squirt out hormone. It's also a growth kind of regulation for the cell. So normal neuroendocrine cells have these somatostatin receptors on them, and we can see that on the Gallium-68 PET scan. So the Gallium-68 PET scan is specific to somatostatin receptors. We also have another PET scan, which is called the Fdg PET scan, which some of you may have heard of. Fdg measures the rate of sugar uptake, essentially, which is what that means, glycolytic activity. It's talking about like the metabolic rate of those cells. Cells that are reproducing really quickly and making lots of new cells, they require lots of energy and they draw glucose from our blood. Our blood's really good. Our bodies are really good at maintaining a stable blood glucose level. So one thing that people ask is, oh, well, if I take out all sugar, will that starve my tumour? Well, maybe you're eating too much sugar and maybe taking sugar out of your diet is going to be a good thing in other ways, but it won't starve tumours. And I'm going down a bit of another rabbit hole, so I might come back to that another time. But just to say that the faster a tumour is growing or the more aggressive a tumour is, the more it will show up on an Fdg PET scan. But you can see here, there's not a line where grade 1s and 2s will show up on a Gallium-68 and only grade 3s will show up on an Fdg. You've got this kind of murky purple no man's land in the middle where you might have both scans and find that you've got a tumor that's actually lighting up on both scans. So it's got somatostatin receptors, but it's also growing fast enough to be using glucose, so it's showing up on the Fdg scan as well. I wish I could see your comments because I'd love to know if that makes sense to you. But essentially, the slower growing the tumour, the more likely it is to have the somatostatin receptors, and the higher the grade, the less of those receptors will be on the surface because the tumours don't, the cells don't look anything like normal tissue anymore. And then the faster it's growing, the more it will show up on the Fdg PET scan. We'll see. When I see the comments, you can tell me whether that makes sense or not and whether I need to do a second version of this back to basics. So the last slide I wanted to show you is the really busy one. And this is all taken from Professor Michael Hoffman's original picture. So this is the original picture that he sent me. And I just think this, once I saw this image, I thought, okay, this finally makes sense to me. So we've got what we know, tumour cells up the top. Really similar to normal neuroendocrine tumours, normal neuroendocrine tissue, right through to really weird, very different. We've got the scan. So the slower growing ones are expressing, they've got more somatostatin receptors turned on. The faster growing ones, they've got more of they're using more glucose. So we see that glycolytic activity on the Fdg PET scan. We've got well differentiated down this end, poorly differentiated down this end. We've got grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, and grade 3B. We've got the Ki67s, which we've talked about. And broadly, these grow from slower growing to rapidly growing. Now, what Michael's done down the bottom here is talked about some of the treatments and some of the potential approaches. So these are often treatments that you will have heard of. So for example, for grade 1 tumours, sometimes if the tumour is not growing at all, it might actually be appropriate to do watchful waiting. And we've got a number of people where they've had a tumour for years, it's not doing anything. So they don't need to give a treatment necessarily that's going to give lots of nasty side effects, because everything that we do to you can cause harm. And we know that somatostatin analogues, which is what SSAs are, can cause things like gallstones, they can cause digestive issues, you know, they can make people feel blur. So if you don't need a somatostatin analogue, they might choose to, or you're finding that you're not tolerating them, they might actually just choose to observe and see what happens over a number of scans. Can be a bit scary, can be really, really play with your head to be on a watchful waiting regime, but it is a legitimate form of management. I guess if you've got a doctor who's suggesting watchful waiting, what I would say is that it's good for these decisions to be made by a multidisciplinary team, because you do want to be having very careful monitoring, particularly in that watchful waiting phase. So the next thing on the list, which I've already jumped to, SSAs stand for somatostatin analogues. So that is either lanreotide or sandostatin LAR. There's also short-acting versions of somatostatin analogues, which is just called octreotide, and I think the brand name for that's also sandostatin, which is really confusing, but they're essentially the monthly butt jabs. That's one for another day. And the third one, the third little acronym here is PRRT. That stands for peptide receptor radionuclide therapy. There's a few other names that people give it. Theranostics is another little term. I heard of radioligand therapy yesterday, but often people will call it lutate therapy as well. PRRT is the term that's on this graph, and I think that's, and it's really another day. Oh, I nearly went down another rabbit hole, seriously. So down the grade 1 end, these are the sorts of treatments. I think the other thing that we haven't really got in here is surgery, is that if we find a well-differentiated, you know, surgery might be the only thing you need if it's a stage 1 tumour. Or even if it's a stage 2 tumour, we find that, you know, actually surgery's on here. What am I saying? So, you know, surgery and liver-directed therapy. So that's like SIRT is a therapy that we hear about. Again, another one for another day. And TACE is when they're giving chemotherapy directly to liver tumours, for another day as well. But yeah, I guess this down the bottom is actually indicating that surgery and liver-directed therapies can be used sort of anywhere along here sometimes. It's a very individual situation with surgery. So, and I'll talk a bit more about surgery in a minute. So in the grade 2s and, you know, sort of heading up towards the grade 3s, we've got, again, somatostatin analogues. So if it's showing up on the Gallium 68 PET scan, it's likely that somatostatin analogues, you know, they're unlikely to harm you, and they may well have an impact both on the tumour squirting out hormones that you don't want, but also impacting on that tumour's growth. And we've got people who very much get tumour shrinkage from somatostatin analogues. But once we get into the tumour cells that are growing more quickly, that brings into play chemotherapy. Now, chemotherapy only targets cells that are reproducing more quickly. So down this very low grade 1 end, there's less of a role for chemo, because those cells won't really be sensitive to the chemotherapy. The chemotherapy won't target them. But by the time we're looking at grade 2s and grade 3s, sometimes there are other reasons for chemo. So sometimes they'll give chemo to, they call it radiosensitized. So if you're having PRRT, sometimes they'll give chemotherapy if you've got a low grade, just to try and make the cells fragile to the effects of the radiation that comes with PRRT. But generally, chemotherapy is more in the grade 2s and grade 3 kind of category. There's a couple of extra therapies here called Everolimus and sunitinib, which I'm not going to talk about at all today. We can look them up. I probably will do another Facebook Friday about Everolimus and sunitinib, but not today. And then the other one is PRRT, like we said. So again, if it's got these receptors, if it's showing up on a Gallium 68 PET scan, it's likely that those tumours will be sensitive to PRRT. So as we go forward, chemotherapy, so when we've got a rapidly growing tumour, obviously I've just said to you that chemotherapy targets cells that are really quickly growing. So, you know, I've got several patients at the moment who have got or have had poorly differentiated neuroendocrine carcinomas, so they're really fast growing tumours. What we find actually is chemotherapy is very effective for that grade of tumour because they're growing so quickly, they're making new tumour cells all the time. The chemotherapy really knocks those around. The tricky thing with chemotherapy is that we get what's called chemoresistance. So what we're still searching for, the elusive kind of, I don't want to say silver bullet, but the elusive thing that we're really trying to work out is how do we get those chemotherapy drugs to work for longer? So we can find that someone will get tumour shrinkage. I've got a person at the moment who's got a, I'm not sure if it's an NEC or I think it might be a well-differentiated NET, but, you know, a very high-grade tumour. He's had chemotherapy and his tumours are no longer visible on the scan. The tricky thing is that we know that probably there are microscopic deposits of tumour still around. What we find then is further chemotherapy, those tumour cells can become a bit resistant and can become a bit more stubbornly growing despite those chemotherapies. So a lot of times people will have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 different chemo regimes. Sometimes we can go back to one that you've already had to try and fool the tumour that it's new. But chemotherapy is an effective treatment for the grade 3 tumours specifically. Sometimes we can still use PRRT. The PRRT is dependent on whether it's showing up on a Gallium-68 PET scan. If it's showing up on a Gallium-68 PET scan, PRRT may be on the table, still may not be. It depends entirely on lots of other things like what your bone marrow is doing, what your kidney function's like, what your general wellness is like, but it still may be considered. So I hope that diagram helps you as much as it helped me. I just think it was a really clever one. It captures so much information in the one image. And for me, I'm a sucker for a cartoon. So you'll be able to see, you know, I like the way that he shows these tumour cells looking so very different to what normal cells look like. So anyway, I'm going to stop sharing and see if I can see some comments. So bear with me while I just click buttons on my computer, and hopefully I can, woohoo, I can see comments. So let me just see, someone's just said, I'm special. I can glow like a Christmas tree on both scans, FDG and Gallium-68. Yeah, and this is the thing. I'm really glad that you've said that because yes, it is possible to have you know, people with nets who are glowing on one and not on the other, people with nets who are glowing on the other and not the one, or you can have like a Big Mac version, you know, the one with the lot. So it sounds like you're a one with the lot. I'm just looking at another comment. So when my oncologist said no evidence of active disease, he was really saying observation. And yeah, absolutely. That's watchful waiting. Because we know that there may well be microscopic little tumour deposits that aren't showing on a scan. We want to catch those really early. So that is absolutely observation or watchful waiting. Can we somehow get a copy of the slides in notes? Oh, that's a really good question, David. Sorry, I used your name. Sorry, I'll try not to use people's names because I know this goes on to YouTube afterwards, but I will have a chat to Professor Michael Hoffman and ask him if he's happy to share. I'm sure he will be very happy because he's extremely generous. But yeah, I'm glad you found those slides helpful. I certainly find the image really, really useful for my slightly remedial brain to get around these concepts. Someone has said, are low-grade tumours always malignant? And I think that is a big question. I'm not going to answer that in great detail today. I'm going to use, I'm going to do another back to basics on benign and malignant. It's already on my list because it's something that a lot of people ask about. But essentially to say that benign and malignant mean different things to health professionals than they do to patients. And we often like to think of them as black and white. It's really not. There's, as you could see on the graph, there's a low-grade end and there's a high-grade end. If you are down the low-grade end, that is more benign If you're up the high grade end, that's very malignant. If you're in the middle, it's a bit more malignant. It's, you know, but so it's another day, it's another rabbit hole, but it's a really good question to ask. I'm just going to see if there's any other questions that come through in the notes while we're waiting. But so you know me, I love a metaphor, and so I'm going to finish the little Facebook, you know, back to basics with a metaphor today, and that is that I want to tell you a story about my garden, and my garden looks like someone lives here who probably might spend a bit too much time in front of the computer, and maybe when she's got spare time, she goes for a run rather than doing the gardening, much to my mother-in-law's horror. But last summer I thought, do you know what? Our family really like pumpkin. I'm going to plant some pumpkin seeds. And so I actually propagated them. I was really super proud of myself. I got some pumpkin that I like the flavor of. I scooped some seeds out. I propagated them. I had little beautiful baby pumpkin seedlings. Put them in pots very tenderly with some fertilizer and some, you know, I sang to them. I watered them. I gave them all of the love. And I got 3 spindly little weedy excuses for plants that didn't even have a flower on them. I was just like, oh, what sort of gardener am I? I already know that I'm not a very good gardener, so that just proved it. But interestingly, around the same time, I did put some compost onto my front garden. So that was in my backyard where I planted these pumpkin seeds so lovingly and carefully and gave them all of the things that the book said. I put some compost on my front garden because it looked terrible. And, you know, so the book said I should do that too. So I put some compost on my front yard, and then I got these triffids growing, and seriously, they were taking over. We've got a driveway that's asphalt. They were growing. The triffid was growing right across the driveway, and I'm like, what is this beast that's sprung up in my front garden? It's not. I didn't plant anything there. And then I noticed, because I hadn't put it out because I'm a terrible gardener, there were massive, bright, yellow, sunshiny flowers on this thing. And I'm like, oh my goodness, that looks like a pumpkin flower. I didn't grow pumpkins. I didn't plant pumpkins. My pumpkin seedlings in my backyard are just looking like they hate the world. And I've got these incredibly huge vines taking over my entire front yard, making a run for the street. And I have to tell you, I've got 8 massive pumpkins growing on these vines. They look glorious. I'm just waiting for them to turn proper orange so that I can cut them off and put them in my cool cupboard for feeling like a proper squirrel, scurrying things away for the winter months. I didn't do anything to those pumpkin plants to make them grow, except that obviously they were growing in some pretty juicy, yummy compost. So that's enough of my story. But I guess the thing I wanted to say is that nets can be a bit like pumpkin seeds. All of the seeds might look the same. They might actually be from the same rootstock, you know, so they might be the same. And they're all of the ones I planted and all the ones that are growing in the front yard are all butternuts. So, you know, it's the same variety. So you might say, look, you know, I've got 10 patients with tumours that look pretty identical under the microscope. But if you put them in 10, you know, in those 10 different patients, they're going to behave in 10 completely different ways. Because if you imagine your body is a bit like a garden, a tumour cell is something that we don't want anywhere near as much as a thriving pumpkin plant. But in some people, tumours just do tend to grow more quickly, and in other people, they just seem to be a little bit more resistant to them in themselves. Some people get super knocked around by chemotherapy, and we can't give very much before we need to start lowering that dose down. Other people seem to sail through chemotherapy without a care in the world. Some people, you give them somatostatin analog injections and they'll get every side effect on the list, and you're just like, gee, can it just cop a break? Other people, again, monthly butt jab, bit sore for a day, that's it, you wouldn't know that you were having it. So we're all really different, and so our tumours will behave differently depending on, you know, what sort of garden we're providing for it. So it's really important to know, and I'm going to extend the gardening metaphor a little bit more and just say we're not comparing apples with apples, even when they look like they're all the same apple. So when you're talking with other patients and they might say, I've got a grade 1 tumour and I'm on this, or I've got a grade 3 tumour and I'm on this, or I've got tumours in my liver, I've had debulking surgery, I've got tumours in my liver, they've told me I can't have debulking surgery. It doesn't mean anybody's got it wrong necessarily. It often just means that your situation, your tumour, your garden is a bit different, and it's behaving differently, it's in a slightly different location. So we are all very much individuals. And so tumours will behave differently accordingly. So I am just going to have a look at the next question, which is, can you have tumours that glow on a gallium-68 that are small, but could be on an FDG also? So if you've got a grade 1, there's something else I wanted to say. Before I answer that, I need to remember the thing. That is to say that sometimes within the one tumour, you can have various grades. So you can have areas within a tumour that are grade 1. You can have other areas in a tumour that are grade 2, and you can also get mutations. So when a tumour spreads from where it started to another location in the body, sometimes you can get a mutation at that point. So it might start off a grade 1, might turn into a grade 2, or even, unlikely, but sometimes even a grade 3. So it's actually if we've got a grade 1 tumour that seems to be growing more quickly, that might be a reason to think maybe there were other cells in there that we didn't get under the microscope that were higher grade, and that's the bit that's growing. So that didn't answer the question about could it be on an FDG also. If your tumour cells are really, really low grade, so the Ki-67 is like 1%, and they've been stable on that gallium-68 PET scan, they may not do an FDG PET scan for you, because obviously every scan they do is extraordinarily expensive, but it also gives you radiation. So, we want to be doing as little as possible to get the best outcome for you. And you may not need an FDG PET scan, but it is something to ask your doctor about. If it, if you have a grade 2 tumour and you haven't had an FDG PET scan, ask the doctor, why? Would it be, when would that be used? Or, how confident are you that the tumours that are just showing on this one scan are the only tumours to see? Good question for your doctor. So pumpkins are now grown from hybrid seeds. So your shop brought wonderful pumpkin seeds you save, and plants don't reproduce well. Oh yeah, they all came from shop bought pumpkin seeds though. So there goes that theory. No, I didn't buy any pumpkin seedlings. I grew them all from seeds I got from my own pumpkin, from the pumpkins I got from the supermarket. So, but I agree with you that I've heard that before, that if you propagate seeds from things from the supermarket, it won't necessarily grow so well. Okay, that's it for gardens and pumpkins and apples and grades and stages. I hope that does help a little bit. Let me know if there are bits of that were, muddy in the comments as you watch it, or, if you're on YouTube later on, there's a comment section on YouTube. I'd love to get your feedback. Also, tell me what else you would like me to talk about. We've got a few exciting guests coming up over the next few weeks, but there will be more back to basics videos. So are there things that people always assumed that you would know about nets that you've never really got your head around? Or what would you have really liked to know in the first 2 or 3 conversations with anyone about nets? We know it's so very complicated and convoluted, and the language is ridiculous. It's very hard to try and learn all of the words. So we want to be able to give you some basic information that'll be helpful. So let me know what you think. I have a couple of things to plug. The first thing is there's a great tip this morning. And I just wanted to remind people that the Facebook private discussion group is a great place to share little tips. That person said using ice before their somatostatin analog injection really helped reduce the pain. That's a tip that I sort of know in my head, but not everybody will. So if you've got a tip to share, then hop into our Facebook private discussion group and share that tip. That's awesome when we have tips like that, because that's what, that's what the community is all about. The other thing I did want to say is that next week we have a special guest who's been long awaited. So that's Professor Jaz Samra. Jaz is a well-known surgeon. He's from Sydney. There's a lot of people in our community whose insides he knows very well, because he's been in there and done surgery on lots of our patients. He's very well known as a surgeon who operates on people's pancreases and livers, so the upper GI system, and he knows a lot about neuroendocrine cancers. He's part of the multidisciplinary team at Royal North Shore. So I am so thrilled to be able to invite Jazz along. We had Professor Ben Thompson last year join us. Ben is also a surgeon from Melbourne, so it's going to be really great to have another surgeon to share their wisdom, and it'll be interesting to see, if there's any points of difference. There's, there often are with these doctors. They might have a slightly different opinion about things. So I'm looking forward to grilling him. I know that there are several questions that people want to ask. There's a Facebook event for that, Facebook Friday for next week. So if you want to, if you've got a question that you want to ask a surgeon, pop it in. I can't promise that we'll address it, but we'll give it a red hot go. I know liver transplants is definitely on the list, so we'll probably kick off there, but we'll see where that conversation goes. The other thing, just to let you know about next week, is that we've got our monthly online Zoom group meeting. So this is a Zoom group that is essentially from our Facebook private discussion group. We have a monthly video chat via Zoom. It's a really lovely chance to see each other's faces and hear each other's voices. We don't have guest speakers, we don't have presenters, there's no agenda, no minutes. It's just a chance to really share your story and hear from others and how they're going. So that is next week on Friday afternoon. If you're in Melbourne or Sydney or Queensland or Tasmania, it's 2:30 till 4 p.m. If you're in the states west of us, then you'll need to look up the time zone. But Facebook shows it in your time zone. So if you're on Facebook and you're having a look at that event listing, it'll show you in the time where your computer is logged into. So I'm really looking forward to that. We brought it earlier a week because there is actually a special catch-up in Melbourne for some people. Some of our unicorns have organised an in-person catch-up in Melbourne the week after, which I'm pretty excited I'm getting to go to, which so I'm looking forward to seeing lots of people there. It's ages since I've seen people post-COVID, so I'm really looking forward to hanging out with some people on that day too. I'm going to stop yabbering because I do this every week, and we all need to have some lunch and a cuppa. It's been lovely joining you. Thank you everyone for hanging in with me, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Take care everyone.